Pillow talks taxes. He has been for over 45 years, and there isn't a human on the planet with more experience solving problems on behalf of taxpayers. He wants to solve your problem whether you know you have one or not. So if you do have a problem, visit his website or call his office and get the help you need. But if you don't have a tax problem, your current tax problem is the tax system itself. And that's actually today's topic. It's been lurking there in the introduction since the very beginning of this podcast. Our tax system is a nightmare. It's unsound logistically, it's unsound economically, and there's a number of episodes that we've had discussing those two things in particular, but it's also unsound morally. And that's what I want to talk about today. That's what we want to talk about today. And it's really quite simple. It boils down to this. Taxation is theft. Theft is against one of God's big 10, and Western morality is founded on God's natural law. That is what has made this country great and prosperous over the time that it has been a nation. So the $4.9 trillion question is, how did we as a society let ourselves get tricked into thinking that a Marxist tax system could coexist with God's natural laws for society?
That is a good question. I think the short answer to that question, Joshua, is the income tax as we know it very slowly encroached to the point where by the time it reached the average American, it was ingrained in the system. For example, when the income tax was first passed as we know it today, it's a result of the 16th Amendment, which was passed in 1913. The income tax was a graduated income tax. It started out at 1%. The top tax bracket was 6%, but the opening income for the bottom bracket of 1% was $25,000. $25,000 in 1913 is probably $400,000 today. So the tax system originally only applied to rich people. Now,
wait a minute. Let me pause you to emphasize that point right there. So you're saying that income taxes are the rich paying their fair share. In the first place, it was always plugged as, well, the rich need to pay their fair share.
It was only the rich that were paying this tax when it first started. And if we go back even a little bit further, Josh, the first corporate income tax was the Corporation Excise Tax Act of 1909. That was really the forerunner to the income tax. It was passed before the personal income tax was passed, and the Supreme Court took the position that Congress had the authority to tax corporations for this reason or that reason. They took the position that it was an excise tax on these businesses based on the privilege of doing business. So the corporation is a jurist person. It's not a natural person. A corporation exists by the grace of the state and not by natural right. The natural rights are expressed in the Declaration of Independence as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So individuals have these natural rights. Corporations don't have natural rights. Corporations are a creation of the state. They exist by grace of the state under the terms and conditions set by the state. And so if the state wanted to create a excise tax that taxed the corporate privilege of doing business, the Supreme Court took the position that they have the right to do that. This is where the Corporation Income Tax Act came from in 1909. That led to the personal income tax in 1913 after the 16th Amendment was ratified. But as I said, that tax only applied to rich people. It wasn't predominantly on rich people. It was only on rich people. And it wasn't until 1940. So we go from 1913 to the World War era. Greater than 90% of the people in the United States never filed a tax return, never paid a tax, never had anything to do with the Internal Revenue Service. It wasn't until 1942 when Congress needed money to prosecute World War that they made that tax, the income tax, which was now pretty much ingrained in at least in high income society by that time. They sold it to the American people as a tool necessary to prosecute World War. We have to have money to fund all the things that the United States is doing to win this war. In 1942, the Victory Tax Act was passed, and that was the first time the federal income tax reached down into the pockets of the average American citizen. Jane and Joe American, for the first time, were touched by the income tax. So this thing has been on the books for 30 years by the time any middle-class American or lower-income American ever had to deal with it. And by this time, the tables flipped. Whereas 90% of the people didn't file a tax return up until this point, now 90% are filing tax returns. And I'll tell you, Joshua, once Congress got its hands on that money, between 1942 and 1946, the budget of the United States, or I should say the revenue to the United States, skyrocketed because of that tax. Once they got their hands on that money, they never let go of it, despite the fact that the war was over and things returned to normal and the production in the United States turned from war production to domestic production. We were out of the Great Depression by this period of time. And house building was running wild across America. Vehicle production was running wild. Industrial production generally running wild again across the United States. And all these GIs were coming home from the war, buying things, houses in particular. The prosperity of America boomed, and Congress never let go of the money. And so here we are.
Because there was more of it at that point. Everything's booming, so now there's even more money. Plus, they're taking even more money from everyone. So why would they let go of it?
The answer is they wouldn't let go of it. They should let go of it. We talk about the morality here. The fact of the matter is a fundamentally immoral position for governments to be taking resources from people that are not necessary to fund the essential functions of government. You use the phrase that taxation is theft. I would disagree with that only in a moderate sense by saying that when you have a voluntary governmental structure like we have in the United States, the systems of government are formed by the voluntary cooperation of people. We formed the federal government through the United States Constitution. The state governments were formed by charter. Local governments are formed by charter, right? This is done by voluntary association of people to organize themselves in a body politic for the purposes of providing essential services that people are not efficiently able to provide for themselves. Fire protection, police protection, court system, and so on. To the extent that those are essential functions of government, it is necessary to fund those essential functions through taxation. To that extent, I would argue to you that taxation is not theft.
Let me stop you right there, because I do have a line of argument for this, but I want to double back. I want to jump back to when you said the income tax started in 1909 for the top $400,000 equivalent.
Well, let me be clear. The Corporation Excise Tax Act started in 1909. The personal income tax in 1913.
So it went 1909, they were taxing corporations. 1913, they brought it to the top income earners. It was World War II that brought it to the masses, effectively creeping from one segment, from the top segment to the almost top segment down to the masses. Would you say that's their playbook for every single tax that has ever been added to the book?
It's not just their playbook for taxes. It is their playbook, and it's not just for taxes. It's for any social experimentation that the government does. It's always by modest encroachment. It starts, the camel gets its nose in the tent, and then pretty soon the head is in the tent. Pretty soon the chest and front legs are in the tent. Pretty soon the camel's in the tent, and you can't get it out of the tent. And so you can just look at all kinds of things that have encroached that way. A perfect example is the Social Security program that is gradually encroaching to a complete national socialist healthcare system. Of course, we got Obamacare now. That is a very significant step along that trail. But ultimately, that's going to lead, if they continue to push it in that direction, to a completely socialized healthcare system like they have in Canada, the United Kingdom, and various other countries around the world. It's done incrementally. Never can they do this stuff overnight. And since we're talking about healthcare at the moment, all you got to do is go back to 1993 when the Clinton administration, the newly elected Clinton administration, tried to create this national healthcare program, and people revolted. They just revolted. But by 2008, under the Obama administration, people were ready to accept this idea because of the slow, gradual encroachments over time.
It's the frog in the pot.
Well, yeah, that's a good example. And Jefferson used the phrase that the natural order of things is for government to increase and liberty to recede. That's the nature of man, is to usurp the rights of other men and to usurp the power and authority that men seem to think they have over other men, rather than just letting them live their life.
The biggest problem is that libertarians don't want to tell other people what to do. So how can libertarians ever be in power?
If we look at the narrow function of government, right, the Declaration of Independence provides what I believe to be a very clear statement, which historians have taken the position, a clear statement on the functions of government. All right, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, they're endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these rights are the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Governments are instituted among men to preserve these. So when you ask somebody what the function of government is, the answer to that question is to preserve the natural rights of individuals. That means that the government's limited function, very narrow, very carefully defined function, is to protect the life, liberty, and property of its citizens from usurpation through force or by fraud, fraud from some outside source, right? That's the function of government. The natural police powers of government are to protect a citizen's life and property from invasion through force or by fraud. It's not to protect you from yourself, provide you with retirement funds, take care of your medical care, buy you food. It's to protect you from invasion and domestic or international so that you can go out and effectively provide those things for yourself and your family. And as long as you are not engaged in force or fraud against some third party, you're not invading their rights, you've got the natural right to function in the marketplace, to buy and sell in the marketplace, to improve your status and your condition.
I like the natural role of government being limited to those items. It's not supposed to increase. It's not supposed to encroach into other things. I think we can actually liken that back to the story of the Tower of Babel. Can you paraphrase the story of the Tower of Babel for us?
The Tower of Babel was this idea that individuals were going to create this means of providing some sort of secular worship to a secular God. The God of Israel came down and scattered those people that were trying to build that Tower of Babel. The story is that's where divergence of languages came from. God instituted these languages in people so they couldn't communicate with each other to create this pagan society where man was God. We're talking about the morality of government, the encroachment of natural laws. When man believes that there is no higher power that he is answerable to, then he himself becomes that higher power, right? So another theological construct is built in the minds of all creatures, whether they know it or not. And so if your theological construct is to worship the living God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, you do it under his rules as expressed in his Bible. But if you reject that, and plenty of people do, Karl Marx, a known atheist who not only didn't believe in the living God of Israel and didn't believe in Christianity, he rejected Christ's sacrifice as just poppycock, but he didn't just reject it intellectually. He was militantly opposed to it. So it wasn't good enough for him to say, there's no God. If you believe that, you're silly, and then go about his business. He openly and viciously attacked Christianity. And what that does, when you do that, when you reject theological constructs, you build your own theological construct. You become the God. This is what we see with Marxists. They believe they have the right and the power to manipulate your life, to experiment with your life, to manipulate markets, take away your right to free choice when it comes to buying and selling, and to insert in your life the will of some third party, otherwise natural right to engage in market transactions. This is exactly what Marxism is, Josh. It is total state control of all three essential elements of an economy: production, distribution, and exchange of goods and services in the marketplace. Under a free market system, you go out into that marketplace as long as you're not invading the rights and liberty of another person, as long as you're engaging in free transactions between individuals with full knowledge of what's going on both sides of the transaction, you're free to buy and sell, you're free to trade, you're free to do what you want to improve your condition. What Marxism does is it takes the power of the state and usurps that free exchange, goods and services in the marketplace. So the construct there is government is the God. The construct there is the state. This is the theological construct. The state becomes the ultimate authority on who can do what. The state becomes the ultimate authority on whether you can trade, the extent to which you can trade, and what you can trade. Because in Marxist governments, the state decides, are you going to work in this factory? Are you going to be a cop? Are you going to be a soldier? Are you going to be a policeman? They decide what you're. All that free choice is taken away from you. The theological construct is the state is God. This is what happens when you reject the truth of the living God.
So yeah, I asked for the paraphrasing and you actually hit exactly where I was going with that idea, with that comparison, right on the head. There is a direct parallel to a number of things in today's society. The accessibility of information has become too vast to sift through, much less understand. Our relevant example here is the tax code, and that's just one part of the bloat of government. Think about the tax code as one single tower in a city of Babel in this modern age. Could this story be a warning against building up bureaucracy, unmanageable and incomprehensible levels? And I think you already answered that question with your rant there. The answer is obviously yes.
Yeah, there's no question that it's analogous. And I'll tell you something else, Josh. When you get man involved, in a position where he now somehow thinks he's the ultimate authority over his fellow man. There isn't any alternative but the buildup of these egregious bureaucracies, the systems of law that we have. The tax code is a perfect example. The tax code consists of more than 4 million words that were changed more than 6,000 times since 2001 alone. And that doesn't even count the changes we've seen in the last 2 or 3 years, especially with the One Big Beautiful Bill Act that just came into law. So anytime you have a situation where man now somehow believes that he's the ultimate authority over his fellow man, you've got endless rules and regulations. God had 10 commandments to order society. We've got 10,000 commandments coming out of the Department of the Treasury, and that's just a part of it. The Treasury Department has, and the Internal Revenue Service has this massive body of regulations. But what about OSHA? All these various government agencies that control manufacturing in the United States and transportation. Just go down the list of all these alphabet soup agencies, thousands of pages of regulations. One of the biggest costs that businesses incur in the United States, apart from their out-of-pocket tax burden and compliance with tax laws, is compliance with other federal government regulations. It's massively expensive.
It's a nightmare. And that circles us right back to where I started at the beginning with taxation is theft, especially in our system today. It's a payment levied under threat of consequence. That consequence is the loss of your freedom, the loss of your property, XYZ, go down the list. So the question then becomes, how someone fund a government in a godly manner? How can a just system be upheld by a fundamentally unjust practice? And is there any way to levy a tax that is inarguably voluntary and sound morally?
I believe in excise, a consumption tax, because you do have some choice with respect to a consumption tax. But we have to start the discussion at an earlier point along the continuum. And we have to start the discussion with this question, John. What are the legitimate functions of government that we could all agree need to be funded? Hone in on that and limit the expenses of government to those things. Then just about any system will work because it won't be oppressive. The need for revenue won't be so great as to engender cheating and require heavy-handed enforcement. When we are funding the legitimate functions of government, I gave you some examples earlier. At the federal level, it would be national defense and pay for the debts of the government and so on. A very, very limited function. Then we can have very low taxation, which would easily be funded through a consumption tax. The problem comes when you start using the government as the lever to enforce transfer payments. And what I mean by transfer payments is when you take money from one person who earned it and you give to another person who didn't earn it, that's not a legitimate function of the government. An argument could be made that at state and local levels, if people come together and decide collectively that they want to fund these things, then, you could make an argument that those state governments, those local governments might have some authority to do that. But the federal government most certainly does not, because Article 1, Section A of the Constitution very narrowly limits what the funding of the federal government can be used for, right? What taxing power can be used for. And taxing and transfer payments are not on the list, all right? They can't use the power of government to take money you earned and give it to somebody else who didn't earn it. One of the things that federal spending has to do is support the general welfare of the nation. General welfare applying equally to everybody. And transfer payments, by definition, cannot apply equally to everybody because one person has to pay it and another person gets to receive it. That's unequal treatment of the taxing power of government. By definition, transfer payments cannot meet the general welfare clause of the United States Constitution. They just can't.
The question is, what is the way to levy a tax that is inarguably voluntary and sound morally? And you come back to the consumption tax every time.
I come back to the consumption tax, but I will add this. There are, by some involuntary elements to taxation that show up even in a completely legitimate situation. We talked earlier about police support and courts. It is inefficient and impossible for people to voluntarily work through a court system. If I've got a dispute with you, a civil dispute, I contracted with you to build me a house, and you build half the house that I contracted for. How can we possibly engage in a voluntary dispute resolution when you didn't voluntarily build the house that I contracted for? There's got to be a third-party court system with power to enforce its decisions in order for me to be protected from the fraud that was implemented by the contractor who built half the house that I contracted for. There's got to be taxation to support that kind of system. And although we might not all want to fund it, the fact of the matter is we all benefit from it. The reason we benefit from it is because now we've got civil courts to resolve our disputes, so we don't have to go out into the streets with sticks and brooms and guns and resolve our disputes that way.
That certainly makes it sound like, as much as I hate to say the cliche phrase out loud, that taxes are certainly something we must pay for a civilized society. Is that what you're getting at?
A Supreme Court justice used that term in a court decision. I think it was Learnham that said taxes are the price we pay for a civilized society. There's certainly some truth to that, because that example of you and I in a dispute over a construction contract, how are we going to settle the dispute if I say to you, you owe me money, and you say to me, no, I don't, and then I say, don't pay me the money, finish my house, you built half the house I contracted for, you come back and say, no, I'm not going to finish the house because as far as I'm concerned, it's done. Now, what do we do with the impasse, Josh?
There certainly needs to be a third-party system that acts like
Dispute.
I was looking for the word equalizer, an equalizer in terms of the markets.
Right. Now,
But people hear things like that and start twisting those words to be able to have government do whatever it is they specifically want it to do.
that really is the problem. When individuals start pressuring government, or we would say lobbying government, for these rules, these restrictions, these regulations, this favorable treatment, and so on. Frederick Bass, the brilliant economist, a French jurist and economist from the 19th century, wrote the book The Law and the Broken Window Theory. People should read Bastiat. He said, when buying and selling becomes subject to legislation, the first thing that gets bought and sold is legislators. This is why you cannot have the government involved in these kinds of restrictions. The government has to be a protective force for good and not an imposition of force to prevent somebody from doing something that otherwise they would have a natural right to do.
Let me go ahead and finish this out by saying perhaps consumption taxes are the price you would pay for a civilized society. Income taxes are the price we pay for a corrupt society. Thanks for watching, taxpayers. Remember, there's no such thing as a hopeless tax case. If you think yours is the exception, get a hold of Dan here. He will help you see the daylight. Dan, tell them where they can follow your Taxpayers' Rights Crusade.
They follow me at Pillow Talks Taxes. I'm primarily on TikTok, Facebook, True Social, and right here on YouTube. Make sure you like, subscribe, and share these videos, especially with your federal and state representatives, your senators and representatives. If you have a tax problem, go to my website, TaxHelpOnline.com. You buy any book off my website at any price point, you get a free 15-minute consultation directly and personally with me. So if you've got some kind of problem with the IRS, I can get you through it. Go to the website, TaxHelpOnline.